I am Wendell. I am 70 years old. I spent my life building a quiet career in aerospace engineering, while my wife Patricia spent my money building her socialite image. 3 years ago, she divorced me and took full custody of our twin sons, Mason and Connor. She sent me a message stating they were ashamed I was their father. I did not fight her. I simply walked away and let her believe she had won. 3 years later, one twin was diagnosed with severe leukemia. The hospital desperately searched for a bone marrow match. I drove straight there and volunteered. The oncologist ran the genetic tests and froze completely. She tested the blood again. Then she called the entire hospital board. They all stared at the results and called it medically impossible. The next 7 words out of that doctor's mouth destroyed my ex-wife entirely. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly gather your strength to destroy the people who took your kindness for weakness. Thick black motor oil coated my hands. I was lying on my back on a cold concrete floor underneath the chassis of a classic car. The heavy scent of grease and old metal filled the tight space of my garage. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The silence shattered when my phone began vibrating violently against the cement near my ear. I slid out from under the vehicle and wiped my hands on a grease rag. The caller ID showed Abigail. She was my 19-year-old daughter-in-law. Connor had married her just 6 months ago against his mother's explicit wishes. When I answered the phone, I did not hear a greeting. I only heard ragged, hysterical sobbing. Abigail could barely string a single sentence together. Her breath hitched as she forced the words out. Mason had collapsed in the middle of his university library. He was coughing up blood onto the floor right in front of his classmates. The paramedics had already taken him away in an ambulance. The absolute fear in her voice paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. My hands stopped moving. The heavy steel wrench dropped from my grip and hit the floor with a loud metallic crack. There was no time to ask questions or demand explanations. I did not bother to wash the dark grease from my skin or change out of my stained work clothes. I grabbed my keys, threw myself into the driver's seat of my truck, and tore out of the driveway, heading straight for Seattle General Hospital. The drive across the city was a blur of gray skies and blaring horns. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles throbbed with a dull ache. I abandoned my truck in the emergency drop-off zone and strode through the sliding glass doors of the oncology wing. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a sickening clinical hum. The waiting room was crowded, but my eyes locked immediately onto Patricia. My ex-wife was standing near the central nurse station. She was dressed in a tailored white designer coat that looked entirely out of place in a busy hospital ward. She was loudly performing the role of the devastated mother. She sobbed dramatically into a silk tissue while a group of young nurses tried to comfort her. She was soaking up the sympathy of every stranger in the room. Then she turned her head and spotted me walking down the corridor. Her performance stopped instantly. The fake tears vanished without a trace. Her face hardened into a mask of pure aristocratic disgust. She stepped directly into my path to block me from entering the main hallway leading to the patient rooms. She raised her voice on purpose, making sure every doctor and patient in the waiting area could hear her words. She told me I had no right to be standing there. She proudly reminded the room that I had lost custody of the boys 3 years ago. She crossed her arms and sneered at my grease-stained clothes. She commanded me to leave the hospital immediately because my presence was a toxic stress the twins did not need while dealing with a medical emergency. She wanted to humiliate me. She wanted me to shrink away and return to the shadows so she could maintain absolute control over the narrative of our family. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back. I stared directly down at her, refusing to give her a single inch of ground. The tense standoff broke when the heavy swinging doors of the intensive care unit pushed open. Abigail rushed out into the crowded lobby. Her face was pale and her eyes were severely swollen from crying. She completely ignored Patricia. She bypassed her mother-in-law entirely and ran straight toward me. She shoved a thick plastic medical chart directly into my chest. Her voice shook uncontrollably as she delivered the devastating news. Mason had just been diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. The cancer was incredibly aggressive and moving much faster than the doctors had originally anticipated. He needed a bone marrow transplant within the next few weeks, or his body would simply give out entirely. The air in my lungs turned to solid ice. My own son was dying. I looked down at the complex medical chart, tracing the terrifying statistics with my oil-stained thumb. Patricia immediately stepped between Abigail and me. She roughly snatched the chart out of my hands. She loudly declared that she had already undergone the intensive donor testing protocol that very morning. She dramatically placed a hand over her heart and announced to the entire lobby that she was tragically not a genetic match for her own son. She wiped away another fake tear for the audience. Then she glared at me with absolute unbridled contempt. She told me to walk out the front doors before I embarrassed the boys with a pathetic attempt to play the hero. She adamantly insisted that my advanced age made me a completely useless and highly dangerous donor. She told the nursing staff to call the security guards if I refused to comply with her demands. She demanded we wait for the National Registry to find a proper, healthy match. I listened to her escalating demands. I looked at the smug satisfaction settling deeply into the corners of her mouth. She genuinely thought she had established a perimeter I could not cross. She believed the medical crisis belonged exclusively to her. I did not argue with her flawed logic. I did not waste my breath defending my physical health or my legal rights as a father. I simply stepped around her as if she were a piece of broken furniture blocking a narrow hallway. I walked straight past the approaching security guard and marched directly up to the primary intake desk. A senior oncologist was reviewing a clipboard on the other side of the counter. I slapped my palm down on the desk to get her immediate attention. I began rolling up the sleeve of my thick flannel shirt, exposing my bare arm to the cold air. I demanded she bring a phlebotomist to the front desk and draw my blood right now for a haploidentical donor match test. I told her I was Mason's biological father, and I was not leaving this building until my marrow was fully screened. The oncologist nodded grimly and quickly signaled a nearby nurse holding a stainless steel tray of needles and vials. I glanced over my shoulder as the nurse wrapped the tight rubber tourniquet around my bicep. Patricia was no longer performing for the crowd. Her face had dropped entirely. The arrogant smirk was completely gone. As the sharp needle pierced my skin and the dark red blood began filling the glass vial, a sudden and unexplainable panic flashed wildly in her eyes. Her manicured hands began to shake violently against her sides. She stared at the small vial filling with my blood, as if she were watching a bomb ticking down to zero. She knew something I did not know yet. But she was about to find out that a father's blood always brings the buried truth to light. The waiting room air grew thick and heavy over the next 2 hours. The smell of industrial bleach and rubbing alcohol coated the back of my throat. I sat perfectly still on a hard vinyl chair. I kept my eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed like a hammer striking an anvil. Across the room, Patricia paced a tight circle. Her designer heels clicked erratically against the tiles. The confident socialite facade she wore earlier had completely evaporated. She chewed nervously on the edge of her manicured thumbnail. She checked her phone every 30 seconds. She refused to look in my direction. The sudden squeak of rubber soles against the floor broke the suffocating silence. Dr. Aris pushed through the heavy wooden double doors. She did not wear the neutral, composed expression of a physician delivering standard updates. Her brow was furrowed. She held a thick red medical folder tightly against her chest. She looked at Patricia and then locked eyes with me. She asked us both to step into her private office immediately. The urgency in her tone left no room for debate. I stood up and smoothed the front of my work shirt. Patricia hesitated for a fraction of a second before marching past me. We followed the doctor down a narrow, brightly lit corridor. The door clicked shut behind us, sealing us inside a small, windowless room. Dr. Aris gestured to the two chairs positioned in front of her metal desk. I sat down. Patricia remained standing. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, like a shield. Dr. Aris opened the red folder and flattened the paperwork with her hand. She looked directly at me and delivered the news. I was a 100% haploidentical match. My bone marrow could save my son. A massive wave of relief crashed over my shoulders. The tight knot in my chest loosened for the first time since Abigail called me. I leaned forward to ask about the surgical schedule. Patricia slammed her hands down on the doctor's desk before I could speak a single word. Her voice was shrill and aggressive. She demanded the laboratory run the test again immediately. She pointed a shaking finger at me and told the oncologist that my age made me a lethal liability. She insisted that extracting marrow from a 70-year-old man would kill him and compromise Mason's fragile immune system. She demanded the hospital ignore my test results completely and put Mason on the National Donor Registry waitlist. She claimed she had the ultimate medical authority to block the procedure. I watched her outburst in absolute silence. A mother watching her son die should fall to her knees in gratitude when a viable donor is found. She should not fight to cancel the life-saving surgery. Patricia was actively trying to stop me from saving our child. Her desperation had nothing to do with my age or my physical health. She was terrified of the blood work. Dr. Aris held up a hand to stop the screaming. The doctor maintained a rigid professional composure. She firmly told Patricia that age was not an automatic disqualifier for a perfectly matched parent in an extreme emergency. She added that my baseline health metrics were exceptional. Patricia slammed her fist on the desk, again screaming that the hospital was making a fatal mistake. She demanded to see the chief of medicine to have my results legally invalidated. Dr. Aris did not flinch at the threat. She simply turned a page in the red folder. She explained that standard hospital protocol for emergency haploidentical transplants requires a highly comprehensive screening. The laboratory had to run a secondary genetic panel on both parents to rule out any dormant hereditary anomalies that could complicate the engraftment process. The doctor looked down at the highlighted text on the page. A deep, highly uncomfortable confusion settled over her features. She looked at Patricia's previous blood work from earlier that morning. Then she looked at the new panel. The silence in the small office became entirely deafening. Dr. Aris took a slow breath. She looked directly into Patricia's eyes. She stated that the laboratory technicians had run the genetic sequence 3 separate times to ensure absolute accuracy. There was no equipment failure. There was no margin for human error. Dr. Aris delivered the devastating blow with clinical precision. "These boys share 0 DNA with you." The words hung in the sterile air like a physical weapon. The truth struck the room with the force of a freight train. Patricia was not the biological mother of the twins. The socialite who had weaponized her motherhood against me for the last 3 years had absolutely no genetic tie to Mason or Connor. Dr. Aris explained that the genetic markers were completely incompatible. The maternal DNA present in Mason's blood did not match a single chromosome in Patricia's sample. Patricia stood completely frozen. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her jaw trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The arrogant, controlling woman who had dictated my family's dynamic for 2 decades was suddenly stripped of all her power by a single sheet of laboratory paper. Her entire existence was exposed as a fraudulent performance. She looked at the doctor with wild, cornered eyes. Then she slowly turned her head to look at me. I did not blink. I sat perfectly still in my chair. I watched the absolute terror consume her features. She had spent 19 years building a fortress of lies around her identity as their mother. She had used that identity to secure full custody and demand astronomical financial support. She had convinced my own sons that I was unworthy of their love. Now the very blood running through Mason's veins had betrayed her carefully constructed reality. Dr. Aris pushed the lab report across the desk. The black ink on the white paper was an undeniable, irrefutable fact, Patricia snapped. She lunged across the metal desk with the ferocity of a trapped animal. Her manicured hands clawed blindly at the red folder. She grabbed the genetic report and attempted to rip the thick paper to shreds. She screamed that the hospital machines were defective. She shrieked that the staff was entirely incompetent and threatened a massive malpractice lawsuit. Dr. Aris calmly pressed a button under her desk to summon hospital security. I remained glued to my chair. I did not try to stop her from tearing the pages. The physical paper did not matter anymore. The truth was already out. The puzzle pieces from 19 years ago slammed together in my mind with horrifying clarity. We had used an exclusive fertility clinic in the city because Patricia claimed she suffered from severe infertility issues. I provided the biological sample. She handled all the administrative paperwork and the medical coordination. I realized instantly that she had secretly utilized an anonymous donor egg. She had faked her biological connection. She executed this massive medical fraud for one specific reason. My family's generational wealth trust explicitly required her to bear biological children to secure her permanent financial payout. She stole the twins' true origin to guarantee her paycheck. I looked at the frantic woman ripping paper to shreds. She had built her entire luxurious life on a stolen foundation. She had weaponized those boys to hurt me. I watched the security guards burst through the office doors to restrain her. I did not feel anger. I felt cold, calculated clarity. The war had just begun. Two heavy-set hospital security guards dragged Patricia backward away from the metal desk. Her tailored designer coat twisted awkwardly around her shoulders as she thrashed against their grip. She kicked her expensive heels at the doorframe and screamed that she would have the entire oncology ward fired by morning. I did not stand up until they successfully pulled her out into the main corridor. The heavy wooden door swung shut, cutting off the sharp pitch of her frantic voice. I thanked Dr. Aris for her meticulous work and walked out of the office. The hospital hallways felt entirely different now. The suffocating weight of my son's diagnosis was suddenly competing with the monstrous reality of Patricia's 19-year deception. I bypassed the crowded lobby and took the service elevator straight down to the subterranean parking garage. The temperature dropped significantly the moment the metal doors slid open. The underground concrete structure was dark and eerily quiet. Water dripped slowly from an exposed overhead pipe, echoing loudly across the empty parking bays. The air smelled of damp cement and raw car exhaust. I walked toward my truck with steady, measured steps. The intense adrenaline from the doctor's office began to settle into a cold, hard focus. I unlocked my vehicle and reached for the heavy iron door handle. The sudden aggressive click of a woman's dress shoes snapping against the pavement broke the silence behind me. I turned around slowly. Patricia stepped out from behind a thick concrete support pillar. The hysterical, frantic woman from the doctor's office was completely gone. She had smoothed out her white coat and fixed her disheveled hair. She wiped a smudge of expensive mascara from under her eye with a steady, unshakable hand. The panicked, feral animal had instantly transformed back into a cold, calculating predator. She walked directly up to me and cornered me against the side of my truck. She invaded my personal space, stepping so close I could smell the sharp peppermint of her breath mints over the smell of motor oil on my jacket. She looked up into my face with absolute venom. She did not apologize. She did not attempt to explain her actions or justify the colossal medical fraud she had orchestrated 19 years ago. She simply leveled her eyes at mine and prepared to negotiate like a ruthless corporate executive. She told me I was a fool if I thought a single sheet of laboratory paper was going to strip her of her maternal authority. She stated that the hospital administration cared about legal liability, not our internal family drama. She bragged that she had already threatened the chief of medicine with a massive defamation lawsuit if he leaked the DNA results to anyone outside that room. She crossed her arms and stared at my grease-stained shirt with her usual aristocratic disgust. She told me my biological connection to the boys meant absolutely nothing in the real world. She reminded me that she had outmaneuvered my legal team during the divorce 3 years ago and secured complete control over my family's generational wealth trust. She smiled a tight, humorless smile. She informed me that she still held all the cards that actually mattered. She leaned in closer and lowered her voice to a dangerous whisper. She told me she was about to give me a very simple choice. She expected me to cower under the weight of her demands. She thought I was still the quiet, accommodating husband she had discarded. Patricia laid out her terms with the ruthless precision of a corporate executioner. She reminded me of the specific clauses buried deep within our divorce settlement. I had walked away from the legal battle to protect Mason and Connor from a highly toxic public spectacle. In doing so, I had allowed her to maintain primary administrative control over the twins' dedicated medical and educational trust funds. It was a massive pool of liquid capital designed to protect my sons from any conceivable disaster. Patricia tapped a manicured finger against my chest. She told me that Mason's acute leukemia required an aggressive experimental pre-transplant chemotherapy regimen. The preliminary hospital billing department had already quoted the initial treatment plan at several $100,000. She stared into my eyes with absolute, unapologetic cruelty. She stated that if I breathed a single word about the genetic fraud to Mason Connor or the hospital board, she would legally freeze the medical trust by midnight. She claimed she would use her administrative authority to lock the accounts in a bureaucratic dispute that would take months to resolve in family court. She knew exactly what that delay meant. Mason did not have months to wait for a judge to untangle a financial blockade. His cancer was aggressive. Every passing hour without the chemotherapy reduced his chances of surviving the bone marrow transplant. Patricia was actively weaponizing our dying son to protect her own fraudulent wealth. She was holding Mason's life hostage to ensure I kept her 19-year secret buried forever. She demanded I walk away from the hospital and let her handle the transplant registry on her own terms. She told me my silence was the only currency that could buy Mason's survival. She looked at me with smug, arrogant satisfaction. She fully expected me to shatter. She expected me to beg for my son's life and promise to keep my mouth shut. She believed her financial leverage made her an invincible god in this scenario. She thought she had effectively placed a permanent gag order on my tongue. She stood there waiting for my complete surrender. She believed she had orchestrated the perfect checkmate. She assumed that my love for my son would automatically neutralize any threat I posed to her carefully curated high society lifestyle. I did not raise my voice. I did not clench my fists or shout obscenities. I did not give her the satisfaction of watching me break down in the middle of a dim parking garage. I looked at the woman who had faked a pregnancy with a surrogate to steal my family's money. I memorized the arrogant, victorious tilt of her chin. Then I reached for the door handle of my truck. I opened the heavy metal door, stepped up into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, echoing loudly off the concrete walls. I put the truck in gear and drove away without looking back at her. I pulled out of the hospital parking structure and merged into the gray city traffic. My phone vibrated against the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. Patricia had sent me a single text message containing a laughing face emoji. She genuinely assumed my silence was complete and utter surrender. She thought she had crushed my spirit and won the war. She was catastrophically wrong. Her threat did not force me into submission. It completely eradicated the last shred of mercy I held for the mother of my children. She had just handed me the exact motive I needed to annihilate her entire existence. My silent adjustment was already forming in my mind. The game was no longer about survival. It was about total, unmitigated destruction. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and headed straight downtown to activate my arsenal. I drove straight from the concrete desolation of the hospital parking garage into the gleaming heart of the downtown financial district. The transition was jarring. I traded the suffocating smell of industrial bleach and raw exhaust for the crisp, climate-controlled air of the Sterling and Hayes building. The heavy glass doors parted silently as I stepped into the opulent lobby. Italian marble stretched beneath my heavy work boots. The receptionist, accustomed to seeing me in tailored suits during our quarterly reviews, blinked in surprise at my grease-stained flannel shirt. I ignored her polite greeting and bypassed the waiting area entirely. I walked directly down the mahogany-paneled corridor and pushed open the solid oak door to Thomas Hayes's private office. Hayes sat behind his massive desk. He was a ruthless corporate litigator who had guarded my assets for 3 decades. He looked up from his dual monitors, his sharp eyes instantly registering the grim determination on my face. I did not bother with pleasantries. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my smartphone, and dropped it squarely onto the center of his polished glass desk. I tapped the screen and hit play. Patricia's cold, calculating voice filled the pristine office. The audio recording captured every vile word of her parking garage ultimatum. She explicitly threatened to freeze my dying son's medical trust fund if I exposed her 19-year genetic fraud. The recording clicked off. A heavy, dangerous silence descended upon the room. Hayes steepled his fingers, his expression hardening into absolute stone. Hayes reached for his desk phone and immediately summoned his lead forensic accountant. He instructed his team to launch a full-scale aggressive audit into every single financial account connected to Patricia and her new fiancé, Mitchell. He demanded bank statements, tax returns, and property deeds within the hour. Patricia had always believed I was merely a retired mechanic who spent his days restoring vintage cars in a dusty garage. During our brutal divorce, she aggressively fought for the house, the cars, and the liquid cash. I let her take the visible assets without a fight to spare my sons the trauma of a protracted legal war. She paraded her newly acquired wealth across high society galas, convinced she had bled me dry. She was entirely oblivious to the foundation of my actual fortune. 30 years ago, I engineered a highly specialized thermal regulation system for commercial aerospace thrusters. I held the exclusive patents. Those designs were currently utilized by 3 major international aerospace contractors. The royalties generated quiet, untouchable millions that pooled into secure offshore trusts. I never flaunted the money because I never needed validation from luxury items. Patricia craved validation like oxygen. As the accounting team fed raw data into Hayes's system, the stark contrast between her public facade and her private reality began to materialize on the screens. Patricia and Mitchell lived in a leased penthouse. They drove exotic cars financed through predatory lenders. They attended charity dinners wearing designer clothing purchased on heavily leveraged credit cards. Hayes scrolled through the digital ledgers with methodical precision. His eyes narrowed as he traced the routing numbers. The illusion of their glamorous lifestyle rapidly dissolved into a desperate, chaotic scramble for liquidity. They were drowning in debt. I leaned forward in my chair, watching the numbers tell a story of profound financial incompetence. Patricia thought she was a brilliant socialite, but she was merely a desperate actress funding a hollow production. She had vastly underestimated the quiet man she discarded. Now her reckless arrogance was going to cost her everything. A junior accountant hurried into the office and handed Hayes a thick red file. Hayes opened the folder and rapidly scanned the highlighted paragraphs. He pushed the documents across the glass desk toward me. The papers detailed the internal structure of Mitchell's highly publicized tech startup. The company was a complete sham. Mitchell possessed no proprietary software, no active client base, and no viable revenue stream. He was operating a glorified Ponzi scheme using new investor capital to pay off older debts while siphoning funds to maintain his luxurious lifestyle with Patricia. But the scheme was collapsing. The startup was hemorrhaging cash faster than Mitchell could secure new victims. Hayes pulled up a secondary banking ledger on his monitor. He turned the screen so I could see the cascading red numbers. To delay their inevitable bankruptcy, Patricia had committed federal wire fraud. She had utilized her administrative authority over the twins' accounts to illegally leverage Mason and Connor's dedicated medical trust fund. She used their protected capital as collateral to secure a massive commercial bridge loan for Mitchell's failing company. The cruelty of her actions hit me like a physical blow. That trust fund was specifically established to guarantee my sons would always have access to premium health care. Patricia had literally mortgaged my dying son's life to buy her arrogant fiancé a few more months of fake corporate success. The money required for Mason's experimental pre-transplant chemotherapy was currently locked behind a wall of fraudulent commercial debt. If Mitchell's company defaulted on the bridge loan, the bank would automatically seize the boy's medical funds to cover the losses. Patricia did not just threaten to freeze the account in the parking garage. She was actively terrified that the hospital billing department would run a deep financial verification and discover the capital was already tied up in illegal corporate collateral. Her blackmail was a desperate attempt to stall the hospital while she tried to untangle the financial knot. She was risking Mason's survival to cover up her own embezzlement. I stared at the damning paperwork. My ex-wife had transformed from a manipulative liar into a dangerous criminal. The rage burning inside my chest crystallized into a cold, absolute resolve. I instructed Hayes to prepare the necessary legal filings to report the embezzlement. Before Hayes could even draft the first document, a sharp, piercing sound interrupted us. My phone erupted with a blaring emergency alert. The harsh digital ringtone shattered the focused silence of the law office. The caller ID flashed Abigail's name. I answered the call immediately. Abigail was hyperventilating on the other end of the line. The background noise of the hospital billing department echoed behind her panicked voice. She told me a hospital administrator had just walked into Mason's recovery room, holding a stack of discharge papers. Patricia had executed her threat. She had officially contacted the hospital administration and used her administrative authority to place a hard bureaucratic freeze on the medical trust. The hospital accounting system automatically rejected the initial claims for the pre-transplant chemotherapy. Without access to the designated funds, the financial directors categorized Mason as an uninsured liability. The oncology board was forced to comply with hospital policy. They had officially suspended Mason's position on the surgical schedule. The life-saving procedure was canceled. Abigail wept, saying security was preparing to move Mason out of the intensive care unit. Patricia had pulled the trigger. She was actively letting my son die to protect her secrets and her stolen wealth. I hung up the phone. I looked at Hayes, the cold realization settling into my bones. The legal battle would take weeks, but Mason only had days. I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I was going back to the hospital. Patricia thought she could starve my son of his medical care by turning off her faucet. She forgot that I owned the entire reservoir. I stepped out of the climate-controlled law office and into the harsh afternoon wind. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me. The echo of Abigail crying over the phone still rang clearly in my ears. She had managed to corner a billing administrator before they wheeled Mason out of the intensive care unit. The administrator handed her a devastating ultimatum printed on a single sheet of hospital letterhead: to bypass the frozen medical trust and proceed with the experimental chemotherapy. The oncology ward required a massive cash deposit. They demanded exactly $300,000 paid in full before the end of the business day. Without that deposit, the hospital legal department classified Mason as a severe financial liability. They were actively preparing to discharge a dying 19-year-old boy into the street. Patricia calculated this exact scenario with malicious precision. She knew I lived a quiet life fixing old muscle cars in a dusty garage. She assumed a retired mechanic could never generate $300,000 in liquid cash on a Tuesday afternoon. She expected me to break under the immense pressure. She expected me to call her and beg for my son's life while promising to keep her 19-year secret buried forever. I climbed into the cab of my truck and turned the ignition. The engine roared to life with a deep mechanical growl. I pulled out of the parking garage and merged aggressively into the heavy city traffic. I did not feel panic. I did not feel the crushing despair Patricia intended to inflict. I felt the absolute unyielding focus of a man preparing to level a battlefield. I drove my truck onto the hospital campus and bypassed the visitor parking lot entirely. I pulled directly into the restricted administrative zone and parked in a space reserved for hospital board members. I turned off the engine and walked through the imposing glass doors of the executive wing. I completely ignored the main waiting room, where anxious families sat waiting for medical updates. I walked past the crowded intake desks and the security checkpoints with purposeful heavy strides. My grease-stained work boots thumped loudly against the polished marble floors of the corporate corridor. A young administrative assistant stepped out from behind her sleek desk to intercept me. She raised her hand and nervously stated that the executive suites were strictly off-limits to standard hospital visitors. I did not slow down my pace. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her I was not a standard visitor. I told her I was there to speak with the chief financial officer, and I was not making an appointment. I bypassed her desk and pushed open the heavy oak double doors leading into the primary financial suite. The chief financial officer was a stern-looking man in a tailored gray suit. He sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk surrounded by stacks of billing reports and dense legal files. He looked up in absolute shock as I invaded his private sanctuary. He stood up immediately and demanded to know how I had bypassed the front security desk. He reached for the telephone to summon the armed guards. I did not give him the opportunity to dial a single digit. I stepped directly up to his desk and pulled a sleek black leather checkbook from the inside pocket of my jacket. I told him we were going to bypass the bureaucratic red tape right now. I demanded he pull up the billing profile for Mason. I told him I was well aware of the $300,000 blockade his department had just placed on my son's life. The chief financial officer lowered his hand from the telephone receiver. He observed my stained flannel shirt and my calloused hands with clear, arrogant skepticism. He stated that Mason's medical trust was currently locked under a severe legal dispute initiated by the primary trustee. He explained with a highly patronizing tone that hospital policy strictly prohibited any surgical procedures without guaranteed funding. He told me the $300,000 figure was not a negotiation tactic, but a mandatory upfront requirement for uninsured experimental treatments. He advised me to leave his office immediately and contact a family law attorney before he called the police. I did not argue with his arrogant dismissal. I clicked my silver pen and opened the leather checkbook. I wrote out a cashier's check for exactly $300,000. The funds were drawn directly from my primary offshore patent account. This specific account held decades of accumulated royalties from my exclusive aerospace engineering designs. It was a pool of liquid capital so massive that this exorbitant medical bill barely registered as a fraction of a percentage. I ripped the check from the binding and slid it across the polished mahogany desk. The chief financial officer looked down at the paper. His patronizing expression vanished instantly. He picked up the check and examined the routing numbers and the official international bank seal. The color drained from his face as he realized the document was completely legitimate and backed by a massive holding firm. He looked up at me with sudden, profound respect. I did not smile back at him. I leaned over his desk and rested my knuckles on the cold wood. I instructed him to clear the outstanding balance immediately. I demanded he pick up his phone and personally call the head of the oncology board. I told him to reinstate my son's surgical preparation schedule without another second of delay. The executive did not hesitate. He typed the routing numbers into his secure terminal and verified the massive transfer of wealth. The green approval notification illuminated his screen. He picked up his desk phone and dialed the intensive care unit. He commanded the nursing staff to halt the discharge process immediately. He authorized the pre-transplant chemotherapy protocol to begin. The financial blockade was completely eradicated. I had just saved my son's life with a single stroke of a pen. I turned my back on the stunned executive and walked out of the suite. I walked back through the clinical hospital corridors toward the intensive care unit. I needed to see Mason and assure him the medical treatment was moving forward. I turned the corner and walked into the sterile waiting area outside his private room. The heavy atmosphere of the ward was suddenly shattered by the sharp, aggressive clicking of designer heels. Patricia marched down the hallway. Her new fiancé, Mitchell, walked closely behind her. Mitchell wore a tight, tailored suit and carried himself with an insufferable, unearned arrogance. He puffed out his chest as if he owned the entire building. Patricia did not notice me standing quietly in the shadows of the corridor. She stormed directly toward Abigail and Connor, who were sitting anxiously on a vinyl bench. She threw her hands in the air and began a loud theatrical performance designed to draw the attention of every nurse and doctor in the vicinity. She wailed that my malicious selfishness had completely ruined their delicate finances. She claimed she had spent the entire morning desperately begging banks for a high-interest loan to save Mason's life. She pointed a manicured finger wildly around the room. She loudly accused me of abandoning my duties as a father and forcing her to bear the impossible financial burden of the medical crisis alone. She wept fake tears and told Connor that his father was the sole reason his brother's surgery had been tragically delayed. She was actively setting the stage to make me the absolute villain of this tragedy. She believed her manufactured narrative was flawless. She had no idea her entire world was about to collapse. I pushed open the heavy wooden door to Mason's private recovery room. The sterile smell of the intensive care unit was entirely overpowered by the suffocating tension radiating from the people inside. Mason lay pale and exhausted against the stark white hospital pillows. Intravenous tubes snaked across his fragile arms. Abigail sat rigidly by his side, holding his hand with a white-knuckled grip. Connor stood at the foot of the bed. He glared at me the second I walked through the threshold. His jaw was clenched tight. He had completely absorbed every single word of his mother's theatrical performance in the hallway. He truly believed my selfishness was the reason his brother was actively dying. Patricia stood near the wiping away non-existent tears with a silk tissue. Mitchell paced the small space between the heart monitor and the visitor chairs. He wore a sharp navy suit that looked utterly ridiculous in a cancer ward. He puffed out his chest and took 2 aggressive steps toward the door the moment I entered. He intentionally positioned his large frame to block my path to my son's bed. He crossed his thick arms and stared down at me with unearned arrogance. He thought his physical presence would intimidate an old mechanic. He wanted to play the role of the protective patriarch, defending his new family from a deadbeat father. The hostility in the small hospital room was thick enough to cut with a steel blade. Mitchell leaned down and invaded my personal space. His expensive cologne completely masked the sterile scent of rubbing alcohol in the small room. He commanded me to turn around and walk right back out into the busy corridor. He proudly stated that Patricia was currently on the phone with elite private lenders trying to secure an emergency commercial loan to fix the massive financial disaster I had intentionally caused. He accused me of weaponizing my own son's failing health just to spite my ex-wife. Connor chimed in from the foot of the bed. His young voice shook with misdirected anger and profound exhaustion. He asked me how I could sleep at night, knowing Mason was going to miss his crucial surgical window, because I refused to contribute a single dollar to the medical treatment fund. I looked at my furious son. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, but I did not raise my voice to defend my character. I did not engage in a screaming match with a boy who had been fed a steady diet of toxic lies for 19 years. I looked at Mitchell and his pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. I simply sidestepped his large frame with a swift, practiced motion and walked directly toward Abigail. She looked up at me with terrified red eyes. She was shaking uncontrollably, fearing the hospital administrative staff was about to arrive with permanent discharge papers. I reached inside the breast pocket of my heavy canvas jacket. My grease-stained fingers grasped the crisp white hospital invoice I had just acquired from the chief financial officer. I pulled the folded document out and handed it directly to Abigail. I gently instructed her to read the highlighted section at the bottom of the page, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Patricia stepped away from the window and ordered Abigail to throw the paper away. She insisted I was playing cruel mind games with a grieving family. I ignored her entirely and gave Abigail a reassuring nod. Abigail unfolded the thick hospital invoice with trembling hands. She stared at the black ink printed across the official administrative letterhead. She blinked several times as if her eyes were playing cruel tricks on her in the dim hospital light. She cleared her dry throat and read the final printed line aloud. She stated the total balance was paid in full. She read the amount of $300,000. She read my name listed as the sole payer on the primary account. The entire hospital room fell dead silent. The only sound left was the steady rhythmic beeping of Mason's heart monitor. Connor stared at his sister-in-law in absolute shock. The aggressive defensive posture he had maintained for the last hour vanished entirely. He looked from the official hospital receipt in Abigail's hand to his mother standing near the window. The narrative she had furiously peddled in the hallway was completely disintegrating right in front of his eyes. If I was the deadbeat father refusing to help, then the $300,000 cash payment made absolutely no sense. Patricia stammered wildly. Her manicured hands flailed in the air as she tried to reconstruct her shattered illusion. She marched over to Abigail and snatched the receipt to examine the payment details herself. She demanded to know where a retired old mechanic acquired that kind of liquid cash. She accused me of forging a hospital document to look like a savior. She claimed the check would undoubtedly bounce and leave them in a worse bureaucratic nightmare by morning. I did not entertain her desperate accusations. I looked directly into her terrified eyes and told her the funds were already fully cleared by the executive board. I told her the surgical preparation was officially back on the schedule. Patricia realized her ultimate leverage was gone. Her threat to freeze the medical trust fund was now completely powerless against my offshore capital. She could no longer hold Mason's life hostage to protect her secret. The panic on her face was deeply satisfying. She had cornered me in the parking garage expecting absolute submission. Instead, she found herself standing in a room with a fully funded surgery and a son who was beginning to question every single word coming out of her mouth. I turned my attention away from Patricia and looked down at my two sons. I told Connor to go back to his university dormitory and pack his belongings immediately. I instructed Abigail to gather whatever she and Mason needed for a long medical recovery. I announced that I was moving all of them into my secure private estate by tomorrow evening. I stated that Patricia's house was no longer a safe or stable environment for a recovering transplant patient. Mitchell flushed a deep, violent red. He lunged forward and aggressively shoved his heavy hands against my shoulder. He shouted that I had absolutely no authority to dictate living arrangements and commanded me to leave his family alone. I did not stumble back. I planted my heavy work boots firmly on the linoleum floor and memorized every single detail of his arrogant face. I looked at the expensive tailored suit he purchased using my son's stolen trust fund money. I brushed the spot where his hands had touched my jacket, as if wiping away toxic dirt. I told him he would need to learn how to keep his hands to himself very soon. I sidestepped him effortlessly and walked out of the hospital room without looking back. Taking Mitchell's fake tech money was no longer just a necessary financial maneuver. It was now a highly personal vendetta. I left the sterile hospital environment and stepped back into the freezing night air. My sons and my daughter-in-law were safely en route to my private estate behind reinforced security gates. The immediate medical crisis was stabilized, but the war was far from over. I drove my truck directly back to the downtown financial district. The city streets were completely empty at midnight. The towering glass skyscrapers stood completely dark except for one floor. The lights inside the law office of my attorney Hayes were burning blindingly bright. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to his personal suite and threw my canvas jacket onto a leather chair. Hayes was sitting behind his desk, surrounded by glowing computer monitors and empty coffee cups. He looked up and saw the cold, absolute resolve locked into my jaw. I told him Patricia no longer possessed any leverage over my dying son. I told him we were officially shifting our crosshairs. Patricia was a desperate, malicious liar, but she was currently operating under the protection of her arrogant new fiancé. Mitchell thought he could push me around a hospital room and intimidate me into submission. He thought his expensive suit and his fake tech money made him untouchable. I sat down at the glass desk and leaned forward. I instructed Hayes to stop looking at Patricia's depleted accounts and aim every single forensic tool we had directly at Mitchell's hollow business empire. I wanted to dismantle the man entirely. Hayes immediately began typing across his dual keyboards. He accessed the deepest layers of commercial financial databases and pulled the unredacted corporate filings for Mitchell's highly publicized technology startup. The man had spent the last 2 years marketing himself as a brilliant visionary software developer. He hosted lavish industry parties and plastered his face across regional business magazines. The reality hiding beneath the glossy exterior was a catastrophic structural failure. Hayes projected the internal accounting ledgers onto the large monitor mounted on the office wall. Mitchell had 0 active software patents and absolutely no legitimate corporate clients. He was operating a severely over-leveraged house of cards. To fund his lavish lifestyle and impress Patricia, he had taken on an astronomical amount of high-risk commercial debt. I watched the red numbers scroll across the screen with grim satisfaction. Hayes isolated a specific transaction buried deep within the corporate liability folder. He magnified this document and pointed his pen at the bottom line. Mitchell had secured a massive commercial bridge loan from a ruthless private equity firm based in New York. The loan was structured with a predatory short-term deadline. Mitchell had a devastating balloon payment of exactly $5 million due in exactly 4 days. If he failed to produce the liquid capital by Friday afternoon, the equity firm would trigger an automatic default clause. The contract stipulated that a default would immediately place his entire startup into corporate receivership. The creditors would seize his business assets, his leased luxury vehicles, and the penthouses he rented. Patricia had drained my son's medical trust fund specifically to help Mitchell make the minimum interest payments on this toxic debt. They were drowning. Mitchell was strutting around the intensive care unit, acting like a billionaire patriarch while standing mere inches away from total financial annihilation. I stared at the $5 million deadline flashing on the monitor. Mitchell tried to put his hands on me. Now I was going to put my hands around his financial throat. I did not hesitate for a single second. I instructed Hayes to pick up his desk phone and directly contact the managing partners of the New York private equity firm. I knew it was past 3 in the morning on the East Coast, but in the world of high-stakes corporate finance, absolute liquidity speaks louder than the hour on a clock. Hayes dialed an emergency executive contact number and put the call on the office speakerphone. A groggy, irritated voice answered the line, demanding to know who was calling so late. Hayes introduced himself as the primary legal counsel for a highly capitalized independent aerospace holding firm. He did not mention my name or my relationship to Patricia. He stated with ruthless efficiency that his client was deeply interested in acquiring the specific commercial debt portfolio currently attached to Mitchell's technology startup. The New York executive scoffed through the speakerphone. He stated that the debt was toxic and highly likely to enter default by Friday. He warned that any buyer would simply be inheriting a catastrophic legal headache. Hayes did not back down. He looked at me across the desk. I gave him a single sharp nod. Hayes leaned toward the microphone and made an aggressive, undeniable offer. He proposed to purchase the entire $5 million debt portfolio immediately in pure liquid cash. To eliminate any administrative hesitation, he authorized a 12% premium on top of the original principal balance. The irritation in the New York executive's voice vanished completely. He realized he was being offered a miraculous exit strategy from a severely depreciating asset. I pulled my black leather checkbook from my canvas jacket. I authorized the immediate wire transfer from my primary offshore patent accounts. The capital generated by my decades of aerospace engineering flowed seamlessly across the country. The New York firm scrambled their late-night administrative team to draft the emergency transfer of ownership documents. We sat in the quiet office listening to the furious typing on the other end of the line. They were desperate to unload the risk. I was desperate to acquire the weapon. Within 45 minutes, the heavy fax machine in the corner of Hayes's office whirred to life. The official legal contracts spilled out onto the tray. I picked up a pen and signed my name on the bottom line, executing the total acquisition of the commercial loan. Hayes verified the electronic signatures and confirmed the routing numbers. The massive wire transfer cleared the international banking checkpoints instantly. A green confirmation banner illuminated the computer monitor. The transaction was officially complete and legally binding. I placed the signed contract squarely on the glass desk. I now owned every single cent of Mitchell's suffocating corporate debt. I held the exclusive right to call the loan due the moment the deadline expired on Friday. The arrogant man who shoved me in the hospital room was now entirely at my mercy. He was walking around the city, completely unaware that the retired mechanic he despised had just become the sole owner of his entire existence. I had successfully manufactured the financial leash I needed to drag him down. But obliterating Mitchell was only half of the silent adjustment. I needed to finish the primary objective. I needed to permanently sever Patricia from my family and strip her of the maternal authority she had weaponized for almost 2 decades. Taking her fake wealth was satisfying, but I needed the physical paper trail of her medical fraud to ensure she lost Connor and Mason forever. I turned away from the glowing computer monitors and looked back at my attorney. I told Hayes to locate the disgraced clinic administrator who handled the in vitro fertilization paperwork 19 years ago. It was time to retrieve the final bullet and load the chamber. The next morning brought a heavy gray rain that beat relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the law office. I sat across from Hayes in his private conference room. The large mahogany table between us was completely cleared of all other cases. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy wooden door clicked open. A junior associate escorted a small, balding man into the room. This was the disgraced former administrator from the fertility clinic we used 19 years ago. He wore a rumpled gray suit that looked 2 sizes too large for his shrinking frame. He was sweating profusely, despite the aggressive air conditioning chilling the room. He clutched a battered leather briefcase tightly against his chest, as if it were a physical shield. He darted his eyes nervously between Hayes and me. The atmosphere in the windowless conference room instantly thickened into a claustrophobic, suffocating tension. He knew exactly why my legal team had tracked him down at his miserable retirement condo. He pulled out a chair with trembling hands and sat on the very edge of the leather cushion. He swallowed hard and attempted to project a false sense of professional authority. He stated he had very little time and demanded to know why he had been summoned under the threat of aggressive litigation. He wiped his glistening forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. Hayes did not offer the man a glass of water. He did not exchange pleasantries or engage in standard legal posturing. Hayes simply opened a manila folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the polished mahogany table. It was a certified copy of the official hospital genetic panel. The laboratory results completely disproved Patricia's biological connection to my twin sons. The former administrator looked down at the highlighted text. His face lost all remaining color. The arrogant facade. he tried to project instantly crumbled into pure, unfiltered terror. He tried to push the paper back across the table, claiming patient confidentiality prevented him from discussing 19-year-old medical files. Hayes slammed his hand flat against the wood. The sharp noise made the older man jump in his seat. Hayes leaned forward and delivered an absolute uncompromising ultimatum. He informed the administrator that our private investigators had already uncovered his history of accepting cash bribes to falsify medical records. He laid out the two exact options currently available on the table. Option 1 involved Hayes contacting the district attorney and filing a federal subpoena for the archives. This route guaranteed the administrator would face severe federal wire fraud and medical malpractice charges. He would spend his remaining retirement years inside a federal penitentiary. Option 2 required immediate total cooperation. He had to open his battered briefcase and hand over the original unredacted files concerning my ex-wife. If he provided the physical proof of her fraud, we would leave his name out of the criminal indictment entirely. The small man stared at the undeniable DNA results. He began to hyperventilate. He knew he was completely trapped in a corner with no legal exit. He looked at my face, hoping to find a shred of mercy. I stared back at him with eyes as cold as stone. I told him he had exactly 10 seconds to unlock his briefcase before I instructed my attorney to call the federal authorities. The terrified administrator fumbled wildly with the brass latches of his briefcase. His shaking fingers finally popped the locks open. He reached inside and pulled out a thick, yellowed file heavily sealed with old medical tape. He placed it onto the center of the table, like a man surrendering his weapon on a battlefield. Hayes took the file and sliced the tape open with a silver letter opener. He began spreading the decades-old documents across the table for us to examine. The sheer volume of the deception laid bare before my eyes was absolutely staggering. The paperwork detailed a highly coordinated, systematic medical fraud. Patricia had not suffered from severe infertility, as she claimed all those years ago. The documents proved she actively hired a desperate young woman to act as a hidden surrogate. I scanned the surgical timelines and the massive under-the-table cash payments Patricia had funneled to the clinic staff to keep the surrogate completely anonymous. The most damning document was buried at the very bottom of the stack. It was a formal consent form authorizing the absolute destruction of Patricia's own biological material and substituting it with an anonymous donor egg. The bottom of the page required both maternal and paternal authorization. I stared at the signature line. My name was signed in stark black ink. It was a flawless, immaculate forgery. Patricia had meticulously faked my handwriting to completely bypass the legal requirement for my consent. She had orchestrated an elaborate lie, including wearing a highly realistic prosthetic belly for 9 months just to present the twins to the world as her own biological flesh and blood. She executed this monstrous theatrical production for one highly specific reason. My family's generational wealth trust explicitly stipulated that she had to bear biological children to secure her permanent ironclad financial payout upon a potential divorce. She stole the origin of my sons to guarantee her access to millions of dollars. She committed massive medical perjury during our divorce proceedings by swearing under oath she was the biological mother. She secured her luxurious lifestyle entirely through an intricately woven web of felonies. I read the specific dates on the forged consent forms. She had planned the entire timeline with ruthless precision. She legally bound my children to a lie the moment they took their first breaths. The administrator sat quietly weeping into his hands, confessing that Patricia had paid him $50,000 to permanently bury the truth. Hayes carefully gathered the original documents and placed them inside a secure legal binder. We officially possessed the physical, undeniable proof of wire fraud and gross medical perjury. I had the exact bullet required to permanently sever Patricia from my family and strip her of all maternal authority. I told the weeping administrator to get out of my sight. He grabbed his empty briefcase and fled the conference room as if the building were on fire. I looked at Hayes and told him we were ready to file the criminal charges with the district attorney. Before Hayes could dial the phone, his computer chimed with an incoming email alert from our private investigation team. He opened the encrypted message and turned the monitor toward me. The investigator had just forwarded a digital invitation circulating among the city's wealthy elite. Patricia was aggressively promoting a massive high society event scheduled for that very evening. It was officially branded as a Leukemia Awareness Charity Gala. The digital flyer proudly featured a large photograph of my dying son, Mason. Patricia was actively using his tragic cancer diagnosis to generate unearned sympathy and solicit fraudulent financial investments for Mitchell's bankrupt commercial real estate project. The sheer audacity of her actions fueled a new intense fire in my chest. I instructed Hayes to pause the legal filings. I did not want to destroy her quietly in a courtroom. I wanted to execute her downfall on her own stage. The courier arrived at the reinforced security gates of my estate, just as the afternoon rain turned to a heavy downpour. He handed the armed guard a thick manila envelope stamped with urgent legal warnings. I sat in my study with Abigail and Connor reviewing the documents Hayes had secured. The envelope contained a formal cease and desist order drafted by Patricia's aggressive family lawyers. The heavy parchment paper explicitly forbade me from coming within 500 feet of the downtown Crystal Ballroom tonight. Patricia was hosting her highly publicized Leukemia Awareness Charity Gala and intended to control the narrative completely. She claimed my presence would cause severe emotional distress to the event organizers and disrupt the fundraising efforts dedicated to my dying son. The sheer audacity of her legal threat was staggering. She was actively using Mason's tragic cancer diagnosis to generate unearned sympathy and solicit fraudulent financial investments for Mitchell's bankrupt commercial real estate project. She assumed a piece of intimidating legal paper would keep the grease-stained mechanic out of her high society spotlight. She wanted to stand on a glittering stage and play the role of the devastated biological mother without any contradictions. Connor stared at the cease and desist letter with pure disgust. He asked if the court order meant we were completely locked out of the venue. I folded the heavy parchment and dropped it into my leather briefcase. I told my son that a piece of paper only holds power if the person reading it acknowledges the authority of the author. I walked upstairs to my master bedroom and opened the heavy cedar doors of my walk-in closet. Patricia had spent 19 years mocking my faded flannel shirts and scuffed work boots. She never bothered to question what I wore when I traveled to Switzerland to negotiate my aerospace engineering patents. I bypassed the casual wear and pulled out a tailored charcoal suit crafted from Italian wool. I fastened a subtle platinum watch around my wrist. The transition from retired mechanic to corporate apex predator took less than 10 minutes. I walked back down the grand staircase looking exactly like the man who quietly commanded millions in offshore capital. Abigail and Connor stared at me in stunned silence. They had never seen this version of their father. I pulled a set of old brass keys from my desk drawer and explained the reality of the situation. 15 years ago, I purchased the historic downtown Crystal Ballroom building during a municipal bankruptcy auction. I acquired the massive property under a completely blind, limited liability company to shield the investment from public scrutiny. Patricia was currently renting the Grand Ballroom to host her fraudulent charity gala. She was actively attempting to legally ban me from entering a building that I owned free and clear. I told Connor to stay at the estate and keep Mason company on the secure video call. I promised them I would return with nothing but the absolute truth. I walked out into the freezing rain and climbed into the back of a black town car driven by my private security team. The ride toward the financial district was utterly silent. The neon lights of the city blurred through the rain-slicked windows. I did not feel any anxiety about the impending confrontation. I felt the cold, mechanical precision of an engineer watching a deeply flawed structure prepare to collapse under its own weight. The car turned onto the bustling main avenue. The Crystal Ballroom blazed with brilliant golden light against the dark, stormy sky. A massive crowd of wealthy socialites and corporate executives huddled under black umbrellas, waiting to clear the velvet ropes at the main entrance. Mitchell had spared no expense setting up a highly visible perimeter. I watched half a dozen muscular private security guards dressed in matching tactical suits checking invitations and scanning the crowd. They held laminated photographs of my face printed directly from the cease and desist order. Patricia had explicitly instructed them to intercept me and forcefully remove me from the premises if I dared to show up. I instructed my driver to bypass the crowded main avenue completely. We drove down a narrow cobblestone alley running directly behind the historic venue. Hayes was already waiting for me by a rusted iron service door holding his heavy legal briefcase. The alley smelled of wet pavement and discarded cardboard boxes. I stepped out of the town car and approached the heavy metal door. This was the original owner's private entrance. It led to a secure freight elevator designed to bypass the public areas of the building entirely. I inserted the old brass key into the rusted lock and turned it with a sharp click. The heavy door swung open, revealing a pristine, brilliantly lit service corridor. Hayes and I stepped inside and locked the storm out behind us. We bypassed the kitchen staff and the event coordinators, rushing blindly through the lower levels. We stepped into the heavy steel freight elevator. I inserted a secondary key into the control panel and pressed the button for the highest tier of the building. The elevator groaned and began a slow, steady ascent. We were rising directly above the lavish ballroom where Patricia was executing her grandest deception. Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out the original in vitro fertilization documents and the hospital genetic results. He handed me the thick file containing the absolute proof of her 19-year medical perjury. The elevator stopped with a smooth mechanical hum. The metal doors slid open to reveal a carpeted hallway lined with vintage oil paintings. We had completely bypassed Mitchell's aggressive security perimeter without a single confrontation. We were now positioned exactly where we needed to be. We stepped silently out onto the shadowed VIP balcony overlooking the massive grand ballroom. The view was absolutely spectacular. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over 300 of the city's wealthiest investors and socialites. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowded floor, carrying silver trays of imported champagne. I walked to the edge of the velvet-draped railing and looked down at the main stage. Patricia stood directly behind a clear acrylic podium. She wore a stunning black evening gown, meant to project profound maternal grief. She clutched a microphone and wept flawless crocodile tears. She delivered a practiced, heartbreaking speech about the agonizing pain of being a biological mother, watching her own flesh and blood suffer through an aggressive cancer diagnosis. She paused perfectly to let her tragic words echo through the silent room. The audience was completely captivated by her fraudulent performance. Mitchell capitalized on the emotional manipulation instantly. He circulated aggressively through the front row of VIP tables. He handed out glossy, heavily fabricated investment brochures for his hollow commercial real estate startup. He quietly promised the wealthy guests that a portion of their massive corporate investments would be generously redirected to fund my dying son's medical trust. I was actively grifting millions of dollars to save his bankrupt company, while Patricia provided the emotional cover story. I looked at the stolen hospital documents in my hand. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit. The time for silent observation was officially over. I stepped away from the velvet-draped railing of the VIP balcony. Hayes walked beside me as we moved toward the grand marble staircase that curved down onto the main ballroom floor. The crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant light that caught the edge of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not try to blend in with the shadows. I walked down the wide, sweeping steps with the heavy, measured tread of a man who owned the very foundation beneath their feet. The quiet confidence of my descent immediately drew the attention of the guests nearest the staircase. Wealthy investors in expensive tuxedos turned their heads. Women in silk evening gowns stopped mid-conversation. The polite murmur of the crowd began to ripple and shift. A wave of hushed whispers spread rapidly outward from the base of the stairs. Mitchell was standing near a front-row table handing a glossy investment brochure to a retired banking executive. The sudden shift in the room's atmosphere broke his concentration. He turned around and scanned the crowd. His eyes locked directly onto me as I reached the final marble step. The arrogant salesman's smile melted off his face instantly. His jaw tightened in pure reflex. He dropped his stack of fraudulent brochures onto the nearest table. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers sharply. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my chest and aggressively signaled his private security detail to converge on my position immediately. 6 muscular men wearing matching tactical suits detached themselves from the perimeter of the room. They moved through the crowd with aggressive military precision. They shoved past wealthy donors and knocked over silver trays of champagne in their haste to execute Mitchell's orders. They formed a tight, impenetrable semicircle directly in front of me. The head of the security detail was a towering man with a thick neck and a coiled earpiece. He stepped aggressively into my personal space and planted his heavy boots on the polished hardwood floor. He crossed his arms over his broad chest and demanded I turn around and walk back out the way I came. He stated that I was trespassing on a private, highly secure corporate event. He warned me that if I did not comply voluntarily, his men would physically drag me out into the alley and hand me over to the local police for violating a legal cease and desist order. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I remained perfectly still and looked the imposing security chief directly in the eyes. Hayes stepped out from behind my right shoulder. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of intimidation. He calmly unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of official municipal documents. He held up a pristine gold-embossed corporate credential card directly in front of the security chief's face. I then unfolded the master property deed for the Crystal Ballroom building. The heavy parchment clearly displayed the municipal seal and the notarized signatures confirming absolute ownership. Hayes handed the deed to the towering guard. He instructed the man to read the name of the holding company listed as the sole proprietor of the venue. He then pointed to my face and identified me as the primary shareholder and executive director of that exact holding company. The security chief took the heavy parchment paper. He scanned the notarized signatures and the municipal seals. The aggressive, hostile posture he maintained just seconds ago began to dissolve. Hayes did not give the man a moment to recover. He delivered a flawless verbal dismantling of Mitchell's entire chain of command. Hayes stated clearly that Mitchell was merely a temporary tenant holding a deeply flawed rental agreement. He informed the security team that their contract was signed by a man currently facing catastrophic corporate bankruptcy. Hayes pointed out that any physical action taken against the legal owner of the building would result in immediate severe criminal charges. He promised the guards that if they laid a single finger on my suit, he would personally ensure they faced federal assault charges and the permanent revocation of their private security licenses. He reminded them that Mitchell could not afford to pay their legal fees because his company accounts were currently frozen by a massive commercial default. The security chief looked from the undeniable property deed in his hand to Mitchell pacing angrily near the front row tables. Mitchell shouted across the room, commanding the guards to throw me out immediately. He screamed that I was a crazy old mechanic trying to ruin a charity event. The security chief looked back at me. I maintained absolute cold silence. I let the overwhelming weight of my legal authority crush the cheap illusion Mitchell had purchased. The chief handed the deed back to Hayes. He tapped his earpiece and issued a sharp, clear command to his men. The 6 muscular guards immediately broke their defensive formation. They uncrossed their arms and took 3 synchronized steps backward. They stood down completely. The human wall blocking my path dissolved into thin air. Mitchell watched his expensive security perimeter evaporate in mere seconds. He stood in the center of the ballroom, completely stripped of his artificial power. He realized he was shouting orders that no one in the room was legally bound to follow. The wealthy investors surrounding him watched the humiliating display of his absolute impotence. The barrier was gone. The path to the main stage was entirely clear. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit and walked forward. I bypassed Mitchell completely as if he were nothing more than a ghost haunting a rented room. I walked straight down the center aisle toward the grand stage. Patricia was standing directly behind the clear acrylic podium. She had her eyes closed in a dramatic display of fake maternal agony. She was delivering a highly rehearsed monologue about the profound spiritual pain of carrying a child in her own womb only to watch him suffer. She was completely oblivious to the silent coup that had just dismantled her entire security force. I reached the base of the stage and placed my foot on the first wooden step. The heavy thud of my shoe echoed through the room. Patricia opened her eyes. She looked down and saw me ascending the stairs. Her rehearsed weeping stopped instantly. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly pale gray. She gripped the edges of the podium so hard her knuckles turned stark white. She opened her mouth, but her breath hitched violently in her throat. Her hands shook against the acrylic surface. The microphone picked up the violent tremor of her fingers. A sharp, ear-piercing whine of audio feedback shrieked through the massive ballroom speakers. The deafening sound forced the wealthy guests to cover their ears. I stepped onto the platform and stood shoulder to shoulder with the woman who had stolen 19 years of my life. I stepped directly up to the clear acrylic podium. The piercing audio feedback echoed through the grand ballroom for one final agonizing second before I reached out. I did not snatch the microphone from Patricia's hand. I simply wrapped my calloused fingers around the sleek metal cylinder and pulled it away from her trembling grip. Her fingers uncurled in absolute shock. She stood frozen to the spot, entirely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of her heavily fortified perimeter. I tapped the head of the microphone once. The sharp thump resonated perfectly through the massive sound system. The 300 wealthy investors and socialites in the room instantly stopped their hushed whispering. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased completely. Every single eye in the crystal ballroom locked onto the 70-year-old black man wearing a tailored charcoal suit standing on their stage. The silence in the room was absolute and profoundly heavy. I looked out over the sea of expensive tuxedos and silk evening gowns. I saw the confused faces of corporate executives who had just been handed glossy investment brochures by Mitchell. I saw Connor sitting at a front-row VIP table, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sudden apprehension. He had never seen me command a room of this magnitude. I adjusted my grip on the microphone. I did not look at Patricia standing petrified beside me. Her presence was entirely irrelevant to the immediate execution of my financial strike. I focused my attention squarely on the elite crowd that had been summoned to fund her lavish lifestyle. I spoke into the microphone with a calm, measured cadence. I thanked every single guest for taking the time to attend a charity gala dedicated to leukemia awareness. I told them that cancer is a vicious, devastating disease that rips families apart and drains them of their hope. I acknowledged their generosity in wanting to support my son Mason during the fight of his life. I saw several attendees nod in polite agreement, completely unaware of the trap closing around them. Then I executed the pivot. I stated clearly that true charity requires absolute transparency. I raised my voice just enough to command the far corners of the ballroom. I announced that the man currently circulating through their tables, Mitchell, was not a successful tech entrepreneur. I told the room he was a fundamentally bankrupt fraud, operating a highly leveraged, collapsing shell company. A sharp gasp rippled through the front row of tables. I did not stop. I detailed exactly how Mitchell had been using my son's tragic diagnosis as an emotional smokescreen to solicit fraudulent financial investments for his dead commercial real estate project. I explained that the glossy brochures they held in their hands were backed by absolutely zero proprietary software and zero active corporate clients. I informed the wealthy donors that Mitchell had promised to redirect a portion of their investments to Mason's medical trust fund. I declared that this promise was a calculated, malicious lie designed to exploit their empathy. I stated that Mitchell was drowning in high-risk commercial debt and desperately needed their capital to avoid catastrophic corporate receivership by Friday afternoon. He was actively grifting millions of dollars to save his own luxurious lifestyle while standing under a banner bearing my dying son's face. The polite, sympathetic atmosphere of the ballroom vanished in an instant. The executives looked down at the brochures in their hands, as if they were holding toxic waste. Angry murmurs erupted across the venue. Mitchell's carefully curated facade was burning to ash in front of the very people he needed to rob. Mitchell hurled a stack of investment brochures onto the nearest table. His face flushed a violent, furious red. He shoved past a prominent banking executive and stormed down the center aisle toward the stage. He shouted at the top of his lungs, commanding the sound technician to cut the microphone immediately. The technician did not move a single muscle. He was an employee of the building, and he knew exactly who signed his paychecks. Mitchell bounded up the wooden stairs of the stage, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He screamed that I was a delusional, bitter old mechanic spreading malicious slander to ruin his legitimate business. He ordered me to get off the stage before he threw me off himself. I did not take a single step backward. I did not even look at him. Hayes stepped out from the shadows of the stage wings with the precision of a seasoned predator. He intercepted Mitchell before the man could reach the podium. Hayes opened his heavy leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of certified legal documents. He shoved the official default notices directly into Mitchell's chest. Mitchell stumbled backward, clutching the papers out of pure reflex. I raised the microphone and announced the final devastating truth to the silent room. I stated that my private offshore holding company had legally purchased Mitchell's entire $5 million debt portfolio from a New York private equity firm at 3 o'clock this morning. I declared that Mitchell was no longer dealing with a faceless corporate entity. He was dealing directly with me. I told the crowd that Mitchell had failed to secure the necessary liquid capital to meet his balloon payment. I publicly called the loan due immediately. I announced that I was initiating the total foreclosure of his startup, the seizure of his business accounts, and the liquidation of his leased luxury vehicles, effective immediately. Mitchell stared down at the legally binding default notices in his trembling hands. The aggressive, intimidating tech founder disappeared. He realized the quiet, grease-stained man he had shoved in a hospital room earlier that afternoon now possessed the exclusive right to annihilate his entire existence. The trap had snapped shut, breaking his financial spine. The reaction in the grand ballroom was instantaneous and brutal. Wealthy investors do not tolerate public financial contamination. The prominent banking executive in the front row dropped his champagne glass onto the table and walked straight toward the exit. Dozens of other executives immediately followed his lead. Chairs scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor as the crowd stood up in unison. Husbands grabbed their wives' arms, abandoning their half-empty drinks and their expensive catered meals. Cell phones illuminated across the dark room as furious attendees frantically dialed their own wealth managers to ensure none of their capital had been transferred to Mitchell's fraudulent accounts. The mass exodus was chaotic but entirely purposeful. They were fleeing a sinking ship to protect their own portfolios. I stood at the podium and watched Mitchell's fake empire collapse in less than 60 seconds. He stood frozen on the stage, clutching the foreclosure papers, watching the very people he needed to save him rush blindly for the doors. He tried to call out to a venture capitalist he had been courting all evening, but the man completely ignored him. The lavish charity gala transformed into a barren, deserted wasteland of abandoned tables and spilled wine. Mitchell was left standing in a silent, empty room with absolutely nothing left to his name. My silent adjustment had stripped him bare. The massive crystal doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind the last fleeing investor. The chaotic roar of 300 panicked executives scrambling to protect their portfolios vanished into the corridor. A profound and heavy silence reclaimed the enormous room. The lavish charity gala lay in absolute ruins across the polished hardwood floor. Overturned gold chairs and shattered champagne flutes marked the exact paths of the panicked exodus. Dozens of glossy fraudulent investment brochures littered the white linen tablecloths like discarded trash. Mitchell stood completely frozen at the base of the stage, holding the foreclosure notices. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked around the empty, cavernous space, realizing his entire corporate empire had evaporated in less than 2 minutes. A few terrified catering staff members peeked out from the kitchen swing doors before retreating into the shadows. The only people left in the center of the devastation were the core players of this tragedy. Connor remained seated at the VIP table directly in front of the stage. He gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. Abigail sat next to him, holding her smartphone up, so Mason could watch the entire confrontation from his hospital bed via video call. Hayes stood quietly near the velvet curtains, with his leather briefcase open and ready. I remained firmly planted on the elevated wooden stage right next to Patricia. The artificial power she had wielded for 19 years was completely stripped away. We were finally entirely alone. The grand illusion was dead. I turned my absolute attention away from the ruined room and focused entirely on the woman standing beside me. Patricia was still clutching the edges of the clear acrylic podium, as if it were the only object keeping her from collapsing. Her face was entirely drained of color. Her perfectly styled hair trembled slightly as a cold sweat broke across her forehead. She had just watched her wealthy fiancé lose his entire commercial future in the blink of an eye. She knew her financial safety net was permanently destroyed. But the loss of Mitchell's fake tech money was only the preliminary strike. I reached inside the interior pocket of my tailored charcoal jacket and pulled out the thick manila envelope Hayes had prepared. I slammed the heavy envelope down onto the acrylic podium right over her carefully written speech notes. The sharp slap of the paper hitting the plastic echoed like a gunshot through the empty ballroom. Patricia flinched violently. I unclasped the fastener and pulled out the stark white hospital laboratory reports. I placed the official genetic panel directly in front of her eyes. Next to the medical results, I laid down the yellowed 19-year-old in vitro fertilization documents we extracted from the disgraced clinic administrator. The forged consent forms featuring my copied signature stared back at her under the bright stage lights. The physical, undeniable proof of her massive medical perjury was now officially out in the open. Patricia looked down at the documents. Her mouth opened in a silent scream. She tried to slide her manicured hands over the papers to hide them, but her fingers shook too violently to grasp the pages. She looked up at me with wild, desperate eyes. She silently begged me to keep her monstrous secret hidden from the young men sitting in the front row. I looked back at her without a single ounce of mercy. I leaned closer to the microphone. I adjusted the tall silver metal stand to my exact height. It was time to burn her carefully constructed maternal identity to the cold ground completely. My deep voice boomed through the massive concert speakers suspended above the stage. I looked directly down at Connor, sitting frozen at the VIP table. I made sure Abigail held her phone steady so Mason could hear every single syllable clearly from his hospital bed. I leaned into the microphone and repeated the exact 7 words the oncologist had delivered to us in her private office. "These boys share 0 DNA with you." Connor jerked backward in his chair as if he had been physically struck. He stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Patricia shrieked and lunged for the microphone to silence me. Hayes intercepted her instantly. He grabbed her wrist firmly and pushed her back against the backboard of the stage. I did not break my eye contact with my son. I continued speaking with absolute surgical precision. I told Connor the entire horrific and devastating truth about his origin. I explained that 19 years ago, his mother had claimed severe infertility. I told him she had secretly hired an anonymous surrogate to carry the pregnancy. I detailed how Patricia had worn a highly realistic prosthetic belly for 9 months just to present the twins to the world as her own biological flesh and blood. I pointed to the yellowed clinic papers resting on the acrylic podium. I announced that she had meticulously forged my signature on the donor consent forms to completely bypass my legal authorization. She executed this monstrous theatrical production for one highly specific reason. My family's generational trust explicitly required her to bear biological children to secure her permanent financial payout upon a potential divorce. She stole the true origin of my sons to guarantee her access to millions of dollars. I told Connor she had committed massive medical perjury during our divorce proceedings by swearing under oath she was his biological mother. I then exposed the final devastating layer of her betrayal. I informed my sons that Patricia had been secretly draining their dedicated medical trust fund for the past 2 years. She used their protected capital as collateral to secure the bridge loan for Mitchell's failing tech company. She actively mortgaged Mason's life to fund her arrogant fiancé's luxurious lifestyle. When the hospital demanded payment for Mason's experimental pre-transplant chemotherapy, she froze his medical account to hide her embezzlement. She was entirely willing to let my own biological son die just to protect her massive stolen wealth. Connor stood up from the VIP table with slow mechanical movements. His chair scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor. He walked up the wooden stairs of the stage like a man moving through a terrible nightmare. He ignored his mother entirely. He stepped up to the clear acrylic podium and picked up the stark white hospital laboratory reports. He read the genetic panel and the highlighted negative markers. I then picked up the yellowed clinic files and stared at the forged signatures on the anonymous donor consent forms. The magnitude of the betrayal crashed into him with crushing force. The woman he had fiercely defended during the divorce had lied to him since the day he took his first breath. He dropped the papers onto the floor. He turned his back on Patricia completely and walked over to stand firmly by my side. He placed a heavy, trembling hand on my shoulder. Patricia let out a guttural, devastating sob. She fell to her knees on the stage. She realized she had permanently lost her sons and her entire identity. She desperately reached her arms out toward the base of the stage. She cried out for Mitchell to come up and help her. She begged her fiancé to call his lawyers and protect her from the fallout. Mitchell stood rigidly at the bottom of the stairs, still clutching his commercial foreclosure notices. He looked up at the desperate weeping woman kneeling under the bright stage lights. He was totally paralyzed. Mitchell stood completely rigid at the base of the wooden stairs. He gripped the heavy stack of foreclosure notices I had just handed him through haze. His eyes darted frantically across the legal text printed on the top page. The bold black letters confirmed his total financial annihilation. He slowly raised his head and looked at Patricia kneeling under the harsh stage lights. The desperate weeping woman begging for his protection was no longer a wealthy high society socialite. She was a medical fraud who had just been publicly stripped of her entire fortune. The generational wealth trust she used to lure him into an engagement was officially void. She possessed absolutely no access to the millions she had promised to inject into his failing commercial real estate venture. Mitchell realized the luxury penthouses, the exotic cars, and the elite status she paraded around the city were all funded by stolen medical capital. The financial safety net he desperately relied upon had just evaporated into thin air. He looked down at the devastating legal documents in his hands. He calculated his options with the cold, ruthless efficiency of a cornered predator. He did not step forward to offer her a comforting hand. He did not climb the stairs to defend the woman who had just mortgaged her dying son's life to save his fake empire. He stood perfectly still and watched her illusion shatter. Mitchell straightened his posture and adjusted the lapels of his expensive, tailored suit. He looked up at the stage with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. He did not see a fiancé in need of emotional support. He saw a massive criminal liability that was about to drag him directly into a federal investigation. Patricia stretched her trembling arms out toward him over the edge of the stage. She sobbed his name and begged him to call his elite defense attorneys to fix the disaster. Mitchell let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed clearly through the deserted ballroom. He took one deliberate step backward away from the wooden staircase. He told Patricia she was completely out of her mind if she thought he was going to tether his own sinking ship to a woman facing decades in a federal penitentiary. He stated with absolute venom that he had only tolerated her suffocating arrogance because she promised him unlimited access to a bottomless trust fund. He declared that without her stolen millions, she was absolutely nothing to him. Patricia gasped as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of her lungs. She dragged herself to the edge of the platform and pleaded with him to remember their upcoming wedding plans and the life they were building. Mitchell threw the heavy stack of foreclosure notices directly onto the polished hardwood floor. He told her the wedding was permanently canceled. He explicitly called her a pathetic, desperate fraud who had single-handedly ruined his last chance at corporate survival. He turned his back on the weeping woman kneeling on the stage. He walked briskly down the center aisle of the ballroom without looking back a single time. The heavy crystal doors slammed shut behind his retreating figure. The loud, reverberating thud marked the absolute end of Patricia's romantic and financial safety net. She was entirely alone with the immediate devastating consequences of her actions. Patricia remained on her knees, staring at the closed crystal doors. Her entire body shook with violent, uncontrollable sobs. The luxurious world she had meticulously constructed through 19 years of deceit had completely evaporated in a matter of minutes. She slowly turned her tear-streaked face away from the empty entrance and looked up at Connor. My son stood tall and rigid by my side on the elevated stage. He held the yellowed clinic files tightly against his side. Patricia crawled a few inches forward across the wooden floorboards. She reached her shaking hands out toward the young man she had manipulated since birth. She begged Connor to listen to her side of the story. She desperately tried to play the role of the devoted mother one final time. She claimed that biology did not matter because she was the woman who had fed him and raised him. She cried out that she had loved him and his brother with all her heart, and that her actions were simply mistakes driven by a deep maternal desperation to maintain their family unit. Connor looked down at the weeping woman kneeling at his feet. His face did not soften with sympathy or forgiveness. The expression he wore was completely devoid of any emotional attachment. He looked at her with the same cold, calculating clarity I had felt in the hospital parking garage. He did not raise his voice to scream at her. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying calm that cut perfectly through her frantic sobbing. He told Patricia that a real mother does not steal her dying son's medical funds to buy a younger man a failing commercial real estate company. He stated that she had actively chosen to let Mason suffer just to protect her own stolen wealth and superficial social standing. He told her she had permanently erased any maternal title she ever held, the exact second she froze that hospital account. He dropped the forged medical documents onto the floor right in front of her trembling hands. He told her she was nothing but a criminal who had used him and his brother as financial hostages. He took a deliberate step backward, placing himself firmly behind my shoulder. He permanently severed the toxic bond she had forced upon him. Patricia slumped forward until her forehead rested against the cold wooden stage. Her desperate pleas dissolved into broken, unintelligible whimpers. She was utterly defeated. I stepped forward and looked down at the ruined woman. I did not offer her a single ounce of pity. I informed Patricia that Hayes had already forwarded the entire portfolio of evidence to the district attorney. I told her that federal wire fraud and medical perjury charges had officially been filed against her name. I advised her to spend her last few days of freedom searching for a very good criminal defense lawyer because she was going to spend the next decade inside a federal penitentiary. I turned my back on her completely. Connor and Hayes followed me down the wooden stairs. We walked straight out of the cavernous, empty ballroom, leaving Patricia sobbing alone under the bright stage lights. We navigated the private service corridor and stepped out into the crisp, freezing rain of the alleyway. The emotional war was decisively won, but the physical battle was just beginning. I climbed into the back of the waiting town car and instructed my security team to drive directly to Seattle General Hospital. I closed my eyes and focused my mind entirely on the upcoming procedure. The sterile smell of the hospital prep room quickly replaced the chaotic memory of the ruined gala. I traded my tailored charcoal suit for a thin blue surgical gown. The time for silent adjustment was over. It was time to save my son's life. The heavy doors of the hospital prep room clicked shut behind me. The chaotic memory of the deserted ballroom vanished entirely. The crisp, freezing rain from the alleyway was immediately replaced by the harsh, sterile smell of industrial bleach and iodine. The temperature in the pre-operative ward was deliberately kept freezing. I stood alone inside the small, curtained enclosure. I took off my tailored charcoal suit and folded it neatly over the back of a plastic visitor chair. I stripped off my shirt and put on a thin, pale blue surgical gown. The cheap cotton offered absolutely no protection against the biting chill of the room. A young nurse walked in and instructed me to lie down on the narrow transport bed. She wrapped a tight blood pressure cuff around my bare arm and began attaching sticky electrocardiogram sensors to my chest. The steady mechanical beeping of the heart monitor filled the quiet space. The emotional war I had just waged against Patricia was decisively won. I had successfully dismantled her stolen empire and exposed her 19-year medical perjury to my son. But the physical battle was only just beginning. I looked down at my weathered hands resting on the crisp white hospital sheets. They were the hands of a retired aerospace engineer who spent his days restoring vintage muscle cars. Tonight, they were the tools required to save my son's life. 2 orderlies entered my enclosure and unlocked the wheels of my transport bed. They pushed me out into the wide, brightly lit surgical corridor. We rolled past dozens of closed doors until we reached the primary operating theater. They parked my bed directly in front of a massive reinforced glass observation window. The adjacent room was flooded with blinding surgical lights. My son Mason was lying on an operating table on the other side of the heavy glass pane. His physical deterioration from the aggressive acute myeloid leukemia was devastating to witness in the harsh lighting. His skin was incredibly pale, and his cheekbones protruded sharply from severe weight loss. The intense pre-transplant chemotherapy required to wipe out his failing immune system had taken a massive toll on his 19-year-old body. Intravenous lines snaked across his thin arms, connecting him to towering racks of fluid bags and digital monitors. A team of masked surgical nurses moved rapidly around his bed, adjusting the sterile equipment. Mason slowly turned his head and locked his tired eyes directly onto mine through the thick glass window. He knew exactly what had transpired at the charity gala. He had watched the entire confrontation unfold through the live video call on Abigail's phone. He knew the absolute horrific truth about his biological origin and the monstrous betrayal orchestrated by the woman who raised him. Yet his face held absolutely no anger or despair. A profound, quiet peace settled into his features. He lifted his weak right arm from the hospital mattress. He curled his fingers into a tight fist and gave me a genuine, exhausted thumbs up. I raised my own hand and returned the gesture. I did not need to speak a single word through the soundproof glass. He knew I had successfully neutralized the threat to his survival. The anesthesiologist approached the head of my bed. She warned me that the sedative would take effect in less than 10 seconds. I kept my eyes locked firmly on my son as the cold chemical liquid pushed rapidly into my intravenous line. The heavy darkness of the anesthesia swallowed me completely. I was submerged into a thick, suffocating void, devoid of all light and sound. The physical procedure of extracting bone marrow is an incredibly violent and invasive medical process. The surgical team had to manually drive hollow steel needles directly into the dense bone of my posterior iliac crest to harvest the liquid marrow. Enduring that level of deep skeletal trauma is immensely dangerous for a 70-year-old man. My body was forced to absorb a massive level of physical shock. Deep within the chemically induced sleep, my subconscious mind registered a sudden, catastrophic shift. The darkness fractured as a blinding, piercing alarm erupted from the surgical monitors. My resting heart rate plummeted dangerously low. The heavy strain of the extraction process overwhelmed my cardiovascular system. The rhythmic, steady beep of the electrocardiogram flatlined into a continuous, shrill scream. Chaos instantly erupted inside the sterile operating room. Muffled, urgent shouts echoed through the fog of my paralyzed mind. The lead surgeon abandoned the extraction needles and yelled for the emergency crash cart. Nurses scrambled across the blood-slicked floor to push heavy doses of epinephrine directly into my central intravenous line. Oxygen was aggressively forced into my collapsing lungs. I was actively dying on the operating table. The cold grip of cardiac failure wrapped tightly around my chest, dragging me further down into the absolute dark. But the deeply ingrained instinct of a father protecting his child refused to surrender. The absolute certainty of my mission anchored my fading consciousness. I could not die and leave my sons to navigate the wreckage of Patricia's deceit alone. I fought the heavy, crushing weight pulling me downward. I focused every remaining ounce of my willpower on the image of Mason giving me that thumbs up through the glass. The chemical shock of the epinephrine finally hit my heart like a lightning bolt. The continuous flatline scream of the monitor stuttered and broke into a ragged, frantic rhythm. My heart muscle violently contracted and forced the blood back through my freezing veins. The surgical team let out a collective, breathless gasp of relief. I had successfully survived the plunge into the abyss. The lead surgeon stabilized my vital signs and resumed the extraction. I sank back into the heavy protective silence of the anesthesia, knowing my foundation was finally secure. I woke up several hours later in a quiet, dim recovery suite. The transition from sleep to consciousness was slow and painfully heavy. A sharp, piercing ache radiated deep within my lower back and hips where the surgical needles had bored into my pelvic bone. The physical agony was immense, but it served as a grounding reminder that I was still alive. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent light filtering through the privacy blinds. My vision slowly cleared. My attorney Hayes was standing silently at the very foot of my hospital bed. He had not gone home to sleep after the confrontation at the charity gala. He still wore his tailored suit, although his tie was loosened and his collar unbuttoned. He held a crisp morning edition of the city newspaper tightly in his hands. He saw my eyes open and stepped forward to the side of my mattress. He did not ask how I was feeling. He simply turned the newspaper around and held the front page up so I could read the bold black ink. The massive headline dominated the entire top fold of the paper. It announced the stunning dawn arrest of a prominent local socialite indicted in $1 million trust fraud. A large color photograph of Patricia sitting in the back of a police cruiser was plastered directly below the text. She looked completely shattered. I stared at the image of the woman who had tormented my family for almost 2 decades. The absolute legal annihilation I had engineered was completely finalized. I let my heavy head sink back into the hospital pillows. The sharp black ink of the newspaper headline commanded my complete attention. It read, "Local socialite indicted in $1 million medical trust fraud." I stared at the large color photograph printed directly below the bold text. Patricia was sitting in the back of a police cruiser with her head bowed and her hands securely zip-tied behind her back. Her immaculate designer coat was wrinkled, and her carefully constructed socialite facade was entirely demolished. Hayes lowered the newspaper and delivered the briefing with his usual ruthless efficiency. He confirmed that federal agents had breached the lobby of her leased penthouse at dawn. They arrested Patricia on multiple felony counts, including wire fraud, medical perjury, and the illegal embezzlement of a dedicated pediatric trust fund. Mitchell suffered an equally devastating fate. Hayes reported that my holding company had fully executed the commercial foreclosure by 8 o'clock this morning. Mitchell's bank accounts were completely frozen, and his heavily leveraged startup was officially placed into corporate receivership. The private equity lenders seized his leased luxury vehicles right out of the underground parking garage. Mitchell was currently facing total personal bankruptcy and severe civil litigation for defrauding his prominent charity gala investors. The fraudulent empire they had built on the back of my dying son was reduced to absolute ash. I let my heavy head sink back into the hospital pillows and took a deep, stabilizing breath. The surgical pain in my hip remained intense, but the profound satisfaction of absolute legal annihilation provided excellent anesthetic. The deep quiet of my recovery suite was abruptly shattered by the sharp vibration of Hayes's cell phone. He answered the call, listened for exactly 10 seconds, and locked eyes with me. He stated that Patricia had just posted a massive cash bail using the last of her hidden personal reserves. She was not fleeing the city or consulting with her criminal defense attorneys. She was currently marching through the sliding glass doors of Seattle General Hospital. Her designer clothes were rumpled from a night in a holding cell, and her makeup was severely smeared. Her desperation had completely overridden her basic sense of self-preservation. She knew her financial safety net was permanently destroyed, and Mitchell had abandoned her to the federal authorities. Her only remaining lifeline was the emotional manipulation of the twin sons she had lied to for 19 years. She intended to breach the intensive care unit and beg Mason for an unearned display of public forgiveness. She believed a tearful reconciliation with a dying cancer patient would grant her leniency with the district attorney. Hayes moved toward the door to intercept her. I raised my hand and stopped him immediately. I told him to stand down and remain in the room. I stated that a father can only shield his children from the storm for so long before they must learn how to board up the windows themselves. I reached for my bedside phone and dialed Abigail's number. I informed my daughter-in-law that the woman who had mortgaged her husband's life was currently riding the main elevator up to the oncology ward. I did not give Abigail a set of instructions or tell her to call the armed hospital security guards. I simply told her the threat was approaching the perimeter. Abigail did not panic or ask me to intervene on her behalf. Her voice was remarkably steady and entirely devoid of fear. She told me she was already walking toward the elevator banks to handle the situation personally. She hung up the phone and walked out to face the predator. The heavy metal doors of the primary elevator slid open with a soft mechanical chime. Patricia stepped out onto the polished linoleum floor of the oncology wing. She was breathing heavily and scanning the corridor for Mason's room number. She did not make it past the front reception desk. Abigail stood squarely in the center of the hallway, blocking the path completely. Connor stood 2 steps behind his sister-in-law, providing a silent, unbreakable wall of support. Patricia immediately launched into a frantic theatrical display. She clasped her hands together and wept aloud. She begged Abigail to step aside and let a devastated mother see her sick child. She claimed the entire federal indictment was a massive misunderstanding engineered by a vindictive ex-husband. She promised she could explain the forged medical documents and the missing trust fund money if they would just grant her 5 minutes inside the recovery suite. Abigail did not yell or engage with the hysterical performance. She did not flinch when Patricia stepped aggressively into her personal space. Abigail simply reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thick legal envelope. She slapped the heavy document directly against Patricia's chest. Patricia reflexively grabbed the paper. She looked down and read the bold black text printed across the front page. It was a permanent judge-signed restraining order. Hayes had expedited the filing. The moment the DNA results confirmed, Patricia had 0 biological rights to the boys. The document legally barred her from coming within 1,000 feet of Mason Connor, Abigail, and me. It explicitly revoked all her previous medical visitation privileges. Patricia stared at the injunction in absolute horror. She looked up at Connor and pleaded for him to tear the paper up. Connor looked at the woman who had lied to him since birth. He stated with absolute freezing clarity that she was nothing but a violent stranger. He told her she had 0 jurisdiction over his family. 2 uniformed police officers stepped out from the adjacent administrative office. Hayes had quietly alerted them the moment Patricia entered the building. They flanked Patricia immediately and grabbed her by the arms. They informed her she was in direct violation of a massive federal court order and was currently trespassing on restricted hospital grounds. Patricia screamed and thrashed against their grip as they forcefully dragged her back toward the elevator banks. The heavy steel doors slid shut, cutting off her frantic cries completely. The toxic element was officially purged from the building. The profound silence in the oncology ward felt like the calm eye of a hurricane. Connor walked back into Mason's private recovery room and locked the heavy wooden door. The immediate physical threat of Patricia was completely eradicated. Hayes stepped out into the hallway and handed Connor a sleek black leather portfolio. The folder contained the official municipal paperwork required to legally alter a birth certificate. Connor and Mason did not hesitate for a single second. They uncapped their pens and signed the thick legal documents directly from the hospital bed. They officially filed the binding petitions to drop Patricia's maiden name entirely from their legal identities. They surgically removed her legacy from their lives with absolute bureaucratic finality. The stroke of their pens severed the 19-year chain of deceit permanently. I watched my sons reclaim their autonomy through the observation window. The devastating emotional war was officially over. We had successfully excavated the rot from our foundation and secured our perimeter against all external threats. But the absolute removal of the antagonist left a massive, terrifying void in the room. The adrenaline that had fueled my ruthless legal campaign began to recede rapidly. The cold, harsh reality of the medical crisis rushed back in to fill the empty space. Patricia was locked in a federal holding cell, but Mason was still lying in a sterile hospital bed, fighting for his life. The bone marrow extraction was complete. The grueling waiting game was just beginning. The ultimate success of my silent adjustment now depended entirely on whether my son's broken body would accept the marrow I had bled to give him. 6 months passed since the sterile cold of the recovery suite faded into memory. The biting winter rain gave way to the heavy golden heat of late summer. I stood inside my private garage behind the reinforced security gates of my estate. The harsh smell of industrial hospital bleach no longer haunted the back of my throat. The rich, warm scent of freshly cut mahogany and raw sawdust filled the open air. I rolled up the sleeves of my faded flannel shirt and ran a heavy iron handplane across the surface of a solid oak workbench. The sharp metal blade shaved off thin curling ribbons of wood with a deeply satisfying mechanical scrape. The physical pain in my hip from the bone marrow extraction was completely gone. My 70-year-old body had healed with the stubborn resilience of a man who finally had a secure foundation to stand on. I wiped a layer of fine sawdust from my forehead using the back of my calloused hand. Sunlight streamed through the large open bay doors, casting long, bright shadows across the concrete floor. The vintage muscle cars parked in the corners of the garage sat perfectly quiet and still. I did not need to rush across the city to fight a war today. I did not need to navigate the toxic labyrinth of my ex-wife and her fraudulent empire. The absolute peace of a quiet, solitary afternoon was the ultimate luxury. I blew a pile of wood shavings off the edge of the table. The steady scrape of my handplane was interrupted by the crunch of gravel outside the bay doors. The heavy footsteps of 2 young men echoed across the concrete driveway. I stopped my work and set the iron tool down on the wooden bench. Mason and Connor walked into the garage side by side. The transformation in Mason over the last 6 months was absolutely miraculous. The aggressive acute myeloid leukemia was officially in complete and total remission. The ghastly pale skin and the protruding cheekbones from the intensive care unit were entirely gone. His face had filled out with a healthy, vibrant warmth. His hair had grown back in a thick, dark layer across his scalp. He wore a simple gray t-shirt that showed the returning muscle mass in his arms and shoulders. He walked with a steady, confident stride that required absolutely no assistance. Connor walked beside him carrying 2 large iced coffees in cardboard carrying trays. The defensive, angry posture Connor used to carry around like a physical shield had completely evaporated. The toxic tension instilled by years of psychological manipulation was purged from his posture. Abigail stepped out of a car parked near the garden and waved at me before heading into the main house. She had been the unshakable anchor for my son during the darkest hours of his recovery. The boys walked directly up to my workbench and placed a coffee cup near my tools. They did not carry the heavy burden of the past 19 years into my workspace. They looked around the garage, admiring the restored engines and the stacked timber waiting to be shaped. Mason took a deep breath of the sawdust-heavy air and smiled. He told me the smell of the woodshop was infinitely better than the sterilized air of the oncology ward. I looked at the 2 young men standing in front of me. They shared absolutely zero genetic material with the woman who raised them. They were my sons in every measurable way that actually mattered. We stood around the oak table drinking our coffee in the warm afternoon sun. We did not speak about Patricia. Her name was completely erased from our daily conversations. The legal system had handled the final stages of her destruction with absolute efficiency. Hayes had called me 3 months ago with the official sentencing report. Patricia was currently wearing a standard-issue uniform inside a minimum security federal penitentiary in California. She was sentenced to serve 6 consecutive years for massive wire fraud and medical perjury. The elite socialite, who once commanded the city's wealthiest charity galas, was now strictly managing a prison laundry schedule. The generational wealth trust she fought so ruthlessly to secure was permanently dissolved. The remaining capital was legally transferred back into my direct control. Mitchell suffered an equally definitive fate. His fraudulent commercial real estate startup was completely dismantled during the corporate receivership process. My offshore holding company liquidated every single asset attached to his name. We sold the downtown office leases and auctioned off the fleet of luxury vehicles he used to project his fake billionaire status. I did not keep a single penny of his toxic money. I instructed Hayes to funnel the entire sum directly into the pediatric oncology ward at Seattle General Hospital. The capital Mitchell tried to steal using my son's tragic diagnosis was completely redirected to fund experimental cancer research and cover the uninsured medical bills of desperate families. The massive financial void Patricia and Mitchell attempted to create was filled with genuine structural support. Mason and Connor had officially completed the bureaucratic process to permanently drop her maiden name from their legal identities. They cut the final administrative cord, binding them to a 19-year-old medical lie. The boys never visited her in the federal facility. They never accepted the frantic collect calls she attempted to place during her first few weeks of incarceration. The woman who treated her family as disposable financial assets was finally treated with the exact same level of absolute disregard. She was buried under the weight of her own monstrous deception. Her entire existence was reduced to a cautionary tale of greed and arrogance. I looked at my sons standing strong and healthy in the bright sunlight. I had successfully navigated the darkest storm of our lives and brought them safely back to dry land. Mason set his empty coffee cup down on a metal shelving unit. He ran his hand over the rough, unsanded edge of a thick mahogany plank resting on the far side of the workbench. Connor walked around the table and picked up a heavy wooden sanding block. He tested the coarse grit of the sandpaper against his thumb. The boys did not ask me for a financial handout. They did not request an apology for the turbulent years we spent separated by a wall of toxic lies. They simply looked at the raw timber and asked me to teach them how to shape it. Mason asked how to properly identify the hidden weak points inside the grain of the wood before applying the heavy lacquer. Connor asked how to ensure the joints would hold the weight of the structure without cracking under immense pressure. I picked up my iron handplane and stepped between my 2 sons. I guided their hands over the rough surface of the mahogany. I taught them how to feel for the invisible stress fractures and how to cut away the rotting elements to expose the solid core underneath. We worked together in a comfortable, unbreakable silence. The loud, frantic noise of the past was permanently silenced. I had endured the blistering humiliation and executed the silent adjustment flawlessly. I had excavated the deep rot from the very bottom of my foundation. The legacy I was leaving behind for my sons was finally strong, authentic, and completely untouchable. If you have ever had to quietly gather your strength to cut toxic family members out of your life, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and share your own story of taking back your power. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss the next part of this journey.